Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Minions 5 Basic Nation Analysis, and today we're going to be taking a look at Middle Age Jotunheim, the Iron Woods. I know it's been a little bit while, once again, since I last did a Basic Nation Analysis. I really do enjoy them. They just take me a little bit more time, especially when I'm doing the thing that I normally do where I play through an entire year of a game and kind of show you that early expansion. And I've really been in a time crunch recently. Videos have slowed down. I've been working a lot of overtime at my day job that actually pays the bills. And I've just had a lot of stuff going on, so I haven't had time to really sit down and record much at all, unfortunately. So we're going to do this in the slightly briefer way. I'm not going to do all the off-camera prep work, essentially. I'm not going to have the year's worth of expansion to show you, but I'll talk about, sort of in the older style, Jotunheim. And what's worth really talking about with Jotunheim is how Jotunheim is the same as Niefelheim, which I talked about a while back, and how it's different, because there are some fairly important differences. The first difference is in the mage core, the first couple of important differences, and there is really three distinctions that have to be made between the Jotunheim line of commanders and the Niefelheim line of commanders. First, the loss of the Niefel Jarl. The Niefel Jarl was, of course, a fairly high-quality heavy thug or super combatant chassis, very powerful water and death magic, high-quality thug chassis in general, the cold aura, ice protection, all that stuff. Niefel Jarls were very interesting and very powerful, albeit limited. Jotunheim loses them completely. You don't have any Niefels anymore. You don't have the Sacred Niefel units. You don't have the Niefel Jarls. You do still have Gygja, but the second major change, the Gygja are now capital only, so you cannot spam these ladies out. For Niefelheim, the Gygja were the primary force of the Mage Corps. For Jotunheim, that's not true anymore, at least not numerically speaking. The third difference is the addition of the Vaetti Hag. And the Vaetti Hag turns out to be Jotunheim's primary mage in terms of numbers. Now, Vaetti Hags are very weak. They only have one path each. It's a random from Astral, Death, Nature, or Blood. However, here's the thing about Vaetti Hags. They only cost 40 gold, and they give you 5 research points. What this means is, if you take Magic 3, which you really should, as Jotunheim, you can be spending 40 gold per turn to crank out 8 research points per turn from every fort. So you're spending very little money on your research compared to most other factions. Most other nations are spending more money on their research than you are. You can be cranking out Vaetti Hags and really getting some value out of them. On top of that, in combat, while Vaetti Hags are weak mages, they are still useful. Half of them can be communion slaves, or can cast basic buffs from Astral or Nature. Half of them can do that. The Nature ones can also cast Swarm. The Death ones are less useful than the others, but with gems, they can cast Death 2 spells. And even without gems, they can summon 1 skeleton per turn each, which doesn't sound impressive, but if you have, say, 10 or 15 of them, that becomes the equivalent of 2 or 3 more powerful, Death 2 or Death 3 mages casting Horde of Skeletons every round, which isn't completely, negligible. It's not super impressive, but it's something. And for 40 gold, honestly, that's incredibly good value. On top of that, of course, a quarter of them are Blood Hunters. Normally, I would say, this isn't super efficient blood hunting. I mean, effectively, you're spending 160 gold to get one Blood Hunter. But honestly, 160 gold is not completely out of line for blood hunting. It's a little bit high, but not completely out of line. And on top of that, all of your others are still useful. So you're not wasting money just looking for the blood randoms. You're doing things with the other mages that they are worth recruiting just for the sake of doing. So in that sense, Vaetti Hags really are one of the cheapest blood hunters in the game. They're just slower to mass up, since, you only get 1 out of 4 of them is actually a blood hunter. So, the addition of a super cheap research monkey / basic buff mage, the removal of a super combatant chassis, and then the relegation of the earlier ages main combat mage to capital only status really changes the way Jotunheim plays. Jotunheim, much more than Niefelheim, is focused on the Skratti. The Skratti are exactly the same as they were. Same cost, same paths, same abilities, same shape-shifting, etc., etc. So, they can still be used in the same way as turbo slaves for turbo communions, but your turbo communions are a little bit harder to deploy because you only have a limited number of Gygja, because you can only recruit them out of your capital. Still, they're not slow to recruit, so you can get a significant number of them, just not nearly as many. However, the Skratti in Jotunheim take much more of a heavy thugging role onto their shoulders, because, of course, in their alternate forms, Skratti are stealthy. And so, they can sneak around, you can forge them all sorts of gear using your native paths, water, nature, astral. There's some death gear, but not a whole lot. Mainly water, nature, astral, and blood. And they can do very, very effective thugging work, because, of course, when they're in their Wolfman form, they still have full slots, and they also regenerate. It makes them very, very tough to handle. And these guys can very effectively raid province defense, fight small armies, cut off retreats, do all that good stuff that you want thugs to do. The only real downside to them is they can't move in the magic phase. They can't teleport, or cloud trapeze, or anything like that. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but still, you can forge them Boots of the Messenger to give them crazy map move. And the crazy map move plus their stealth makes them very tough to handle. So, those three are the only mages you have as Jotunheim. Jotunheim only has a total of 3 mages. You do have the Jotun Jarl, who is a priest level 1, and these guys are all the same as they used to be, except they have slightly better armor. Chainmail hauberks and iron caps have come into fashion, so Jotun Jarls have 18 prot now, which I don't believe they had before. The only new thing is the chief. The only other new thing, I should say. The chief is a leader of the Vetter, the little goblins, the wolfkin. And he's interesting because he's fairly cheap, level 40 leadership, and stealthy. Pillager really doesn't matter, but stealth really does. In particular, in addition combined with snow move and forest survival, this guy can move very, very rapidly through all sorts of terrain, even in Cold 3, which gives you a lot of mobility since he's also map move 20. You combine these guys with the new Vetter units. You have the Vaetti, basic infantry unit, not super impressive in any real way, but size 1, so they can pack a lot of attacks into one square. That makes them relatively usable. They're not as good as Bakemonosho are now, since Bakemonosho became size 1, but they're still not unusable. They're not terrible. Their biggest problem, I would say, is just low damage. 12 pierce, even though it is piercing, 12 damage is still low enough that it won't accomplish a whole lot. If you were an Earth nation, it wouldn't be nearly as big a problem, because you could just drop Strength of the Earth on them, but you can't. As Jotunheim, you don't have any Earth magic, so that makes it tough. The Wolf Rider, also, Wolf Riders are a pretty solid unit, to be honest. They're very fast, they're stealthy, they have snow move and forest survival, they get 2 attacks, so even though they are, you know, relatively low quality attacks, they can still get some damage done through mass, just like the Vaetti on foot. And you can use them as raiding parties with your chiefs to really annoy the hell out of the enemy. Their morale is not fantastic, which can be a problem, but they do have higher than average magic resistance, and their defense skill is pretty decent. On top of that, if I recall correctly, if a Wolf Rider dies, you do get the wolf, I think? I don't actually remember if that's true. I think it is. But, I mean, wolves are very bad units anyway, so it wouldn't really matter all that much. You also have the Moose Riders. Moose Riders are terrible. Don't recruit Moose Riders. The reason they're terrible is that their attack and defense stats are both low, and their protection is 4. So even though they have 38 hit points, realistically speaking, they die very quickly. Their 2 melee attacks are not super impressive and at low attack values. They get to fire 2 short bows, but do you really want to be paying 25 gold for 2 short bows? That's a little... I mean, you're paying 12.5 gold per bow shot, and it's a very low quality bow shot. I really wouldn't recruit Moose Riders. If they were Tramplers, then that would be something else, because they are combat speed 20-4. But as it is, I just really wouldn't bother. They are stealthy, I guess, but you've got better stealthy options. You don't need something that has 4 protection and 5 magic resistance to be doing your stealth raiding. Beyond that, all these guys are basically the same. Like I said, the armor has gotten slightly better, so they're up to prot 18 on many of the Jotun units. It's interesting that actually the Jotun Spearmen and Jotun Axemen have prot 18, whereas the Huskarls only have prot 15. They wear the older style of armor, the ringmail instead of chainmail. And then the Jotun Hirdmen, they have prot 18, so they're back up to chainmail. If you're going to be recruiting Jotun troops, which you won't be able to really avoid as Jotunheim, I would probably recommend Jotun Javelinists and Jotun Herdmen primarily. Javelinists are a little bit cheaper, and they have the javelins, so they can do damage before the lines clash, which is always nice. Militia are a little bit... militia can still work, but their attack skill is so low that it's kind of sad. And then instead of Huskarls, I would just go up to Herdmen. Herdmen have a pretty high-quality, powerful, high-damage melee attack, and enough prot and HP to tank quite a few attacks. So they're not bad, especially once you get to late game and you can be dropping, you know, wooden warriors and mass regeneration and stuff on these guys. Then they're really fairly decent. Your sacred unit, the Garmhirting, is the equivalent of the skin shifter from Niefelheim, except he can no longer shift his skin. He doesn't turn into a wolf when he dies. He does have Berserker +2 and hits like a fucking truck. That's basically the end of the list of Garmhirting's positive qualities. Now, can be worthwhile. If you have something that you need to kill that you need to hit like a fucking truck, Garmhirtings are a way to go. In particular, because they berserk, they're not going to run away. They have enough hit points that usually they survive a couple of hits from something and do go berserk. Their magic resistance ain't bad. Their strength, of course, is tremendous, which leads to them hitting really, really hard with those battle axes. All of that is nice. That said, I wouldn't necessarily go in for a really super heavy bless for Garmhirtings, just because I would rather have scales as Jotunheim. Now, it is nice to have a regeneration bless, in particular because you can shroud your Skratti, to weave that into your turbo communions, and to help use them as thugs that regenerate even more than they already would. Regeneration also really does help your Garmhirtings, so it's not a bad choice to grab regeneration, and if you're grabbing regeneration, you may as well get something a little more minor that combos well with it. Things that combo well with regeneration: Blood Bond. Blood Bond is hugely efficient with regeneration. Fire and shock resistance. What else? Basically anything that kind of helps you live longer against specific threats combos well with regeneration, because if you bring down the amount of damage that's coming in, that gives more time for your regeneration to catch up and surpass the damage that you've already taken. Garmhirtings regenerate 4 hit points a round, so they do so pretty rapidly. Most human troops are going to struggle to kill Garmhirtings. Another thing you might do with Garmhirtings is drop an attack buff on them, so that they hit more often with that huge damage slashing attack. If you can get them up to where they're hitting really consistently, then they'll do a lot of work. They'll grind right through a lot of human units. The biggest problem with them, I found, is that they do die, because their defense skill is only 10, plus they berserk and it goes down, and then their prot is only 12. So even just basic bitch human infantry can hurt Garmhirtings, and will. And you really have to kinda figure out something for them that keeps casualties down if you're going to be using them very heavily. But I wouldn't use them very heavily. You use these guys to expand, that's fine, but maybe you bring some out if you have a specific target that needs to be hit with tons of raw damage in order to die. But beyond that, I wouldn't really focus on using them. What you focus on doing with Jotunheim is leveraging your powerful Gygja turbo communions, like Niefelheim did, and then using Skratti as thugs and raiders, and ramping up blood magic pretty quickly. If you can get up to high-level blood magic as Jotunheim, then you're in a pretty good spot. You can throw down Illwinter, which is a nice little global, both in that it blocks up a global slot, and in that it makes the whole world cold, which makes your troops happier and everyone else's troops less happy, since all of your guys have cold resistance. I think even the Vaetti... Well, I guess the Vaetti don't have cold resistance. But you know what? Fuck them. They're just little goblins, right? Who cares? In terms of national spells, Jotunheim has a bunch, which are generally shared with Niefelheim. You can summon Glossos, which are... they're not super impressive. They're basically just pigs. That said, they're pretty cheap. Only a little over 1 gem each, so not a terrible decision. You could summon a whole bunch of bears, but I don't know why you'd want to. Brood of Garm is a pretty decent spell because Jotun Wolves are sacred. So if you've taken a bless, including regeneration and maybe something else, then Jotun Wolves can be pretty scary. Beyond that, I wouldn't say they're necessarily worth 2 gems apiece, but this spell exists, it can help you out. Jotun Draugr are very neat. They're like wights, in a way, but they're A, giant, and B, they have tons and tons of HP, and then they change size as they lose hit points, which can be useful, to be honest. If I recall correctly, they get bigger as they get injured, which also makes them stronger. Your other national spell beyond those summons is Illwinter, of course. So, entire world, 50% chance of up to 4 points of unrest per province, cold +1 every month for 4 months, random attacks in cold provinces. Now, this has been changed, I believe. Illwinter used to just set the whole world to cold 3. Period. Now I think this actually means that every 4 months cold increases by +1. So it's a slower process. It used to just be, bam, you're cold, that's it, fucking deal with it. Which was hilarious. Illwinter, like I said, is not super impressive at actually, like, wiping out your enemies or anything, but it makes life slightly easier for you and slightly harder for everybody else. Plus, those random attacks can really help you if they land on provinces that, say, block up enemy movement or whatever. Things that Niefelheim wants in blood. Well, obviously you've got the blood death stuff, because you have the Gygja. You've also got easy access to Ice Devils and Frost Fiends if you want them. They're not super impressive, but they can be useful. If you happen to random a Death 3 Gygja, or even just Death 2 and something, you can easily ramp that up to summon Vampires. Vampires are an excellent idea for you. If you're just dead lucky enough to get a Death 4 Gygja, then that'll break you into, like, you know, Skull Faces and all the high-level death stuff immediately. You can't count on that, though, because, of course, that last random is only 10%. So, you can plan on having access to Death 3. You can plan on having access to Water 3 and Blood 3. You can plan on having access eventually to Nature 3 as well, but only in limited quantities. Beyond that, you're kind of going to have to play with a fairly limited magical toolkit. Once you can get up Blood and start summoning, like, the Heliophagi and the Frost Fiends and stuff, then you'll branch out a little bit, but not super far. I believe you'll be able to use the Heliophagi to break into... Well, there's Heliophagus who breaks you into death, but you don't need that. Yeah, it's kind of challenging for Jotunheim to break out of their circle of national paths, absent getting a hold of some good indies. Your main strength as Jotunheim is the Skratti. The Skratti are, as I said, high-quality thugs, high-quality mages, excellent Turbo-Communion slaves. Their paths are not the greatest for combat, generally speaking, but when they form up in a Sabbath, that doesn't matter, because either the Gygja can use them as batteries, or they can use each other as batteries, and be casting, you know, death and nature spells, and all that rot. You do need more Skratti for that, but you may well have that number of Skratti, because you are going to be recruiting a bunch of them. Troop-wise, it's better than Niefelheim. That addition of the extra 3 points of prot is actually important. It puts you up to the point where human units are only going to be doing chip damage to you almost all of the time, which means that your Jotun units can get some, you know, payback in. That said, even so, most of these units I would try to avoid recruiting if I didn't have to. Jotun Javelinists, like I said, even though they have the lower prot, they've got the Javelin attack so they can whittle the enemy down before contact. That's really nice. Jotun Hurlers, honestly, aren't bad for their siege strength. They cost only about 3 gold, 4 gold per siege strength, which isn't a bad deal, if you want them for siege chaff. And then Jotun Herdmen, of course, are expensive, like really expensive, but they're accurate enough and tanky enough and hit hard enough to be worth it. This is probably the best balance of the size for troops that I'm talking about here. 40 gold, but really high quality melee attack, shield, high prot, decent defense skill. Yeah, okay, I'll take that. And the Jotun Javelinist, 30 gold for, you know, a very high quality ranged attack at decent range, actually. Albeit you probably want to try and get the enemy to come as close as possible before you volley your javelins. Melee attack, high damage, not super high attack score, but that's okay. Yeah, most Jotun are pretty bad troops, but those two are decent. And, of course, although they are size 4, you can still chaff them somewhat by mixing them with Vaetti. In fact, you can even mix them in with Wolf Riders if you want, because Wolf Riders are only size 2. So you have chaff options, you have okay troop options, you have powerful mages, you just don't have very many of them. Your biggest problem as Jotunheim is going to be grinding out enough magic power to prevent people from trying to destroy you. It is doable. You are going to be relying on the Gygja a lot, just like Niefelheim did, and then as you get later and later in the game, Gygja are going to fade back slightly. They are still important. They're still the main mages that are going to be leading your Skratti or Turbo Communions, if you can. But you are going to... basically, you're going to want to transition away from, like, the Doomstack big field battle style of fighting as quickly as you can. Because Jotunheim has a lot of raiding and thugging options. You've got the Skratti, you've got the goblins, the Vaetti, who can run around raiding behind enemy lines pretty effectively. Your troops are relatively unimpressive, barring a couple of minor exceptions. Your mage core is expensive and a little bit limited, so you don't want to get into a big knockdown, drag-out, full frontal army fight against, like, Tianxi or Facia or any other faction that has a cheaper, more efficient, and more powerfully magic-backed army. That said, you can still do the infinite skill spam thing out of Gygja. You have, you know, 2 Skratti here in wolf form with a regen bless and a regeneration ring, and then somebody casts personal regeneration. Oh, look at that, they're regenerating like a fucking 13 or 14 hit points around. And your, you know, 8 Gygja can happily sit there spamming out Horde of Skeletons literally forever. That's very annoying when Niefelheim does it, it's very annoying when Jotunheim does it. And it can be very effective if the enemy doesn't happen to have the counters to infinite skeletons at his fingertips. So, hopefully this has been an interesting discussion to some degree. Before we quit, though, let's talk about Pretender Gods. There's an argument to be made in favor of taking an expander for Jotunheim, because A, you're in the Middle Age, which is full of cancerous nations that expand incredibly quickly, and B, like I said, your troops aren't super impressive, so there are times when you will fail expansion just because they ran into something that was a little tougher than you thought it was. Your expander options are somewhat limited, unfortunately. You can get the Son of Fenrir, who isn't a bad expander, especially because he comes with a couple of free Sacred Jotun Wolves. If you give him a decent bless, he can expand pretty well. Berserker +7 pushes his prot up to 20 when it activates, which isn't bad at all, and it also kicks his attack skill way up. However, he still only gets 1 attack. That can be an issue. You can take the Earth Serpent if you want to be super fucking boring and for everyone to hate you. I kid. Earth Serpent is nothing like as good as he used to be, but still an option, albeit an expensive one. Or you could take the Lenormor. Lenormor is a very decent expander, with the poison gas and the multiple attacks and the fear and all that. But on the downside, it's fairly expensive, and it's hard to get any paths except water and death. But as Jotunheim, if you want water and death, you just recruit Skratti until you get a death random. And water is just not a super strong path above ground, generally speaking. So, Lenormor, good expansion choice. After expansion, might be a little hard to find something to do with it, especially because it does spread death scales, which is a little bit unfortunate. Your other option is, I mean, up here, I guess I should mention a couple of these. You do have the Son of Niefel, who I don't personally think is very impressive, but is very thematic. He's basically just a giant Niefel Jarl on crack. He's got a huge chill aura, he's got the cold power, the ice protection. He monster summons winter wolves when he's in cold scales. And I believe he also has to be in your dominion, but that's kind of a cool effect. Winter wolves are... Winter wolves are pretty nice. They're ethereal. They're one of the elemental spirits. So, not bad there. Father of Winters, Great Mother is probably the closest thing you've got to an Awake Titan expander. Prot is very, very low, but does regenerate at 10%, have a lot of hit points, and trample. So especially if you ratchet Earth up a ways, you can get her to a respectable protection level, and she can, in fact, trample her way through most independents. I'm not going to say all, but most. So taking her to expand is not a terrible idea either. I wouldn't take either of these guys necessarily. Maybe the Demi-Lich, you can do some of the math to see if the Bless that you want and the scales that you want work out better on the Demi-Lich or on one of the Rainbow chassis. Most of the time I think it's going to be the Rainbow chassis. I think the Demi-Lich pays a pretty significant premium for all his special abilities, most of which are counteracted by the fact that he can't fucking move. So that can be a problem. You can still teleport him around if you give him Astral, but it's just kind of a tax on taking the Demi-Lich and using him to do anything. All that aside, though, my personal favorite for Jotunheim is an immobile. And I like Irminsul, because Irminsul gives you that regeneration bless for almost nothing. So you can take him awake if you want. You should definitely go up to cold 3 scales. It won't really hurt you all that much, since it's already cold 3 like half the year in Jotunheim if they stick with their standard scales. So this isn't actually going to reduce your income by anything like 5%. And it's going to free up another 40 points so you can take another scale. Growth, obvious. I would, as I said, definitely take magic on Jotunheim. What you have to cut to pay for it remains an open question. I would probably cut down to turmoil in exchange for magic. You could also drop down into misfortune if you want, albeit I'm reluctant to dip into misfortune too much just because I've gotten too used to having luck 3. And every time I see an event, I go, ooh, hey, maybe it's money or gems or something instead of, ah, shit, it's an event. Which is what happens when you're running misfortune 2 or 3. Up to you, though. I think this is a highly efficient, just sort of basic pretender chassis. You can take it dormant if you want, or imprisoned. If you want to expand with Garm Herdings, then taking Awake is a good choice. And if you want to expand with Garm Herdings, you might also want to give them some other kind of defensive bless. Which would mean taking something like a Monolith. Monolith already has a nice wide path spread, has some nature, albeit not as much, has some astral, has some earth. The Monolith is mainly great because it's incredibly tough. And so in the mid and late game, you can teleport this guy around onto armies who aren't expecting it and crush them. On top of which, as I said, it can carry a slightly wider bless. That will require losing some scales. If you have the regeneration and then you also have, like, Astral 6 or 7, ideally, in order to prevent it from being mind controlled, you're gonna have to cut some scales, unfortunately. So you're probably gonna have to, you know, like, do something fairly drastic. Like, that would do it, but that's really painful. You can play around with it, tweak it a little bit. I wouldn't cut Astral down below 5, certainly, because that's just asking for some asshole with 1 pearl and a dream to mind duel you and kill your Monolith just instantaneously. But if you're careful about where you send it and what the situation is, then you can avoid that by just not having that confrontation, which is a pretty decent way to do it. In terms of other god chassis, you do have a couple of national ones, the Bog Mummy, the Skratti, and the Dracolich. I don't think any of them are super good. This guy can shape change like all Skratti can, I believe. The Bog Mummy is immortal, which is nice, and starts off with Death Blood Path, so that's not a waste. The Dracolich, I think, is just kind of too expensive. He can shape change into a Bog Mummy. But for just death, and with 80 new magic path cost, 200 points, I wouldn't. In almost any situation I can think of, I just wouldn't. I would get something else that's more efficient for the specific purpose. It kind of looks to me like the Dracolich is trying to do too much by being an expanding super combatant and a vampire summoner and I don't know. I just don't think this is a good call price-wise. If he was like 160, yeah, okay, maybe then. Other than that, you have the bog standard assortment of human or demi-human rainbow chassis. Frostfather ain't a bad one. Great Sage also isn't bad if you want a ton of research quickly. He's good at that. He is an inspiring researcher, so all of your little tiny Vaetti Hags will get yet another +1 from him if they're in the same province, making them 9 research points for 40 gold. That's pretty cool. And on top of that, of course, he has +15 research himself, so you slap a bunch of paths on him, and he can research like hell. So, I hope this discussion has been useful. In general, Jotunheim plays a lot like Niefelheim, but instead of having the Niefel Jarls as kind of big centerpieces and thugs and big bads, that role sort of shifts to the Skratti. The Skratti are also serving as the Turbo Communion slaves for your Gygja. You don't have many Gygja, but they are very powerful and valuable. And then you have Vaetti Hags, which are really cheap lab monkeys and just real basic magic buffing. Troop-wise, your troop lineup isn't fantastic. You have a few real stinkers in there, but you can, with Jotun Javelinus, Herdman, and Garm Herdings, you can scrape together pretty decent forces, bulked out with Vaetti and Wolf Riders, and really compete on the field fairly effectively. What you want to be doing as Jotunheim is expanding early, aggressively, getting stable borders, researching up while you vulture on a neighbor who's fighting with someone else or something. Get to where you can drop Illwinter and finish racing up the blood tree. Blood is really Jotunheim's saving grace, as it were. All their other stuff is cool, but it's kind of a sidelight to the blood if you can manage to bring in enough, demon troops and unique demon summons and etc., to sort of bolster your army so that you can compete on a level playing field with all those other guys who have tons more useful mages than you do because their mages are cheaper and more specialized. In any case, thanks once again for watching. Hope this has been helpful, and I will see you all in the next one.